Good evening. I've got my Bibles open to 1 Kings chapter 18. I invite you to turn there as well as we begin our study this evening. Certainly good to see everybody. I hope that you've all had a good day. We know that we have. It's been a beautiful day being with Christians all day long. What a wonderful blessing that is. It's good to be able to eat with the leeches this evening. You know, that kind of sounds funny, doesn't it? I didn't even think about that. Eat with the leeches this evening. But anyway, eat with, let me say it differently. We got to eat with Missy and Darren this evening, and we also got to be with their sons, Zach and also Jake and also Dale this evening. We enjoyed our time together. It was very good. Food was good, but the conversation was even better, and just association, being with brethren. And what a wonderful blessing it is when we have these gospel meeting seasons, whether it be in the spring or in the fall. We are able to travel to different congregations and visit with one another, and it's good to see people from other congregations. I love coming back to this part of the country and seeing old friends, family, really, from congregations far away, and really appreciate you coming and being with us. People who've helped mold who we are today, me and my family, and so we appreciate all of you who are able to be here. It's an encouragement to this congregation and specifically to me. I appreciate your attendance here this evening as well. What a blessing it is that we can be together and sing those songs of praises and open God's word again this evening. This week we are studying the life of Elijah from the book of 1 Kings. And we saw yesterday that Elijah went to King Ahab and told him in chapter 17 that it would not rain until he prayed again that it would. And of course, that was judgment upon Ahab, and it was a judgment upon Jezebel, and it was judgment upon the people of Israel who had turned their backs on the one true God because of their worship of Baal, as well as many other immoral practices. And for 3 years, this drought continued, and every month the situation got worse and worse until finally it is time for a showdown, which is what we're going to talk about this evening, where everyone must choose what side you're going to be on. The confrontation on Mount Carmel that we're going to be looking at here in 1 Kings chapter 18 reminds me of one of those old Western movies where you got the good guy who's dressed in white and the black guy the bad guy dressed in black, and they meet on Main Street in Dusty Gulch. And it's time for this showdown with one another. This is the climax. And what we see, we left off last night with Elijah in Zarephath. And he is there with this widow who God has appointed to take care of him through this drought. Now, as we open up the pages of our Bibles in chapter 18, verse 1, after months of this drought going by, finally God sends word to Elijah, and he says, "Go and show yourself to Ahab," which was a dangerous thing to do because Ahab's wife, Jezebel, had already killed some of the prophets, any that she could get her hands on. As you read through the first half of chapter 18, which we're not going to do this evening, but you can see that Jezebel tried to kill some of these prophets. And there's a man by the name of Obadiah who actually hides some of these prophets from Jezebel so that they cannot be taken. So at this point, they are trying to get rid of Elijah as well. Now, as far as Ahab and Jezebel are concerned, you remember we spoke of yesterday that Elijah is public enemy number one. He, in their eyes, is the cause of all these problems, that he is the one who forecast this famine, that it would come, and he is the one who troubled Israel. And as a result, that's exactly how Elijah was greeted by King Ahab when he comes on the stage here in verse 17. When Ahab sees Elijah, Ahab said to him, "Is this you, O troubler of Israel?" I don't know, but I imagine that Ahab probably looked at Elijah not as a messenger of God, but more like a magician, a sorcerer, that he may have thought of the drought somewhat as an evil spell, not as a punishment that is brought upon himself. Many times people who are doing what is wicked, They don't view bad things that happen to them as judgment, because that would mean there's consequences I must change. Instead, this must be someone else's fault that I'm going through this. And so he didn't feel guilty at all. According to verse 17, he views this as Elijah's fault. Elijah, you're the troublemaker. You're the one who's brought all this trouble upon the land. You're the one who's brought this terrible drought, and as a result, this terrible famine that all of us are going through. People are dying because of you, Elijah. But Elijah's response in verse 18 is, I've not troubled Israel, but instead it is you and your father's house have, because you have forsaken the commandments of Yahweh and you have followed the Baals. And so Ahab's family, Omri, and now this new generation of a king sitting on the throne had rejected God, and they had shown a total disregard for God's commandments. Their whole society was this rotten, immoral, greedy, violent, materialistic society, and it was led by this king. Lots of times it starts at the top, doesn't it? This whole nation is following down this path of worshiping Baals and the Asherah. So Elijah calls for a showdown. He calls for this face-to-face confrontation with all the false prophets of these heathen gods. And we read in verse 19 that Elijah continues here as he says, I'm not the troubler, you are, because of your sins. Now send and gather to me all Israel at Mount Carmel, gather with 450 prophets of Baal and 400 prophets of Asherah who eat at Jezebel's table. And so he is calling for them to come at Mount Carmel, rather. You know, there are certain stories in the Bible that have become so well known that as we mention a person's name, we automatically think of that particular event. For example, it's hard to talk about Noah without thinking about the flood, right? And it's hard when we say Joshua without thinking about the walls of Jericho falling. Or maybe we think about David and we automatically think of maybe Goliath. And we say Elijah, maybe it is this incident here with Mount Carmel that we think of, this showdown that happens here. Mount Carmel was a flat, large mountain near the Mediterranean Sea on the western part of Palestine. And from the top of this mountain, you have this commanding view in all directions. You can look everywhere and you can see all over the place. This is the highest point in this particular area of Palestine. And Mount Carmel was important in the Old Testament for military and political reasons, because whoever controlled Mount Carmel controlled the northern half of Israel. But it was also a key religious location, because this is where the priests and the prophets of Baal would set up their altars. This was the center of Baal worship. You'll hear about in the Old Testament oftentimes the high places and worshiping on the high places. And that started with these paganistic rituals, because their idea was the higher we are to the gods, the more that they will hear us. We need to get closer to them so that we can have their ear and we can get what we want from them. So many of the places of worship under the paganism is on high places. It's associated with that. That's one of the reasons why God says, I don't want you worshiping in the high places. I only want you worshiping at the temple. Well, in the short time that Baal worship had been introduced to Israel, it was wreaking some havoc now on God's people. It was a religion that involved human sacrifices and immorality. It appealed to agriculture, it appealed to economics, and it appealed to your fleshly desires, because really Baal worship allowed you to do whatever you really wanted to do in the flesh and call it a religion. And most importantly, though, and probably worst off, is that it took glory from the one true God. And so what Elijah says is that Yahweh will not tolerate this kind of behavior among his people. So let's meet at Mount Carmel and we will settle this issue once and for all. Now, notice here that Elijah was challenging the prophets, these paganistic prophets, on their own home ground. You know, he could have insisted, since it's just him, and he's on one side, just one of him, and there's 850 of these others, that at least he should be given some advantage. Let's go to my place and do this. Let me have the home court advantage in this situation. But Elijah doesn't want there to be any excuses. He doesn't want anyone to come along after this contest and say, well, if you did it our place, maybe we would have had an advantage. That's where our God hears us there. And so he didn't want anyone later saying, no, making any type of excuses like that. And so he says, let's do it there. So he is doing this, what he's about to do in this chapter, on their own home turf. Now, verse 20 says, so Ahab sent a message among all the sons of Israel, and he brought the prophets together at Mount Carmel. Now, it appears that although Elijah, back up in verse 19, had called for 450 prophets of Baal and 400 prophets of Asherah, we never hear about those 400 prophets of Asherah later on in this chapter. I don't know if they showed up or not, but we do know that the prophets of Baal do show up. But I do want to make an important point. Sometimes I think when we picture this scene, we just picture the prophets and Elijah. But understand later on, Ahab is there as well. And he says, call all of Israel. And so now all of Israel is gathered there too. I don't know, certainly not every single Israelite was there, but you've got to have thousands of people probably who've come to see this showdown now on Mount Carmel. But still, from a human perspective, Elijah here is way outnumbered. And as this competition started, there they stood, at least 450 prophets of Baal on one side, and Elijah on the other. And Elijah is the one who speaks up first. And he addresses all the people in verse 21. He came near to all the people, probably thousands of people, as I mentioned, and he says to them, how long will you hesitate between two opinions? If Yahweh is God, follow him. But if Baal, well, follow him. But the people did not answer him a word. Now, I want you to notice here, it says, how long will you hesitate between these two opinions? If you're reading from your New King James versions there, it says, how long will you falter between these two opinions? The English Standard Version is a little bit more literal, more accurate, actually. It says, how long will you go on limping between two opinions? You're limping here. You're not making a decision. You're not standing up for something. Instead, you've gone limp in not making a decision here. One paraphrase of this translation also says, how long will you have it both ways? And I think that's really what they're trying to do. They want to have it both ways, but he says, you need to make a decision. If Yahweh is God, follow him. If Baal, well, follow him. And this touched really at the very heart of the problem that was going on here. You see, you might have this impression as you read through 1 Kings that the people had just forsaken Yahweh altogether, that they're not worshiping the one true God, Jehovah, at this time in Israel's history. But that's not the case. They certainly didn't worship the one true God correctly. They weren't going to Jerusalem and worshiping at the temple like they were instructed to do. They had not done that since the days of Jeroboam, but they hadn't all out rejected Yahweh either. They were guilty of what is known as syncretism. Syncretism is when you have two or more religions that are different, that are blended together. And the idea is if one God is good, then two gods must be even better. And that's a very popular idea in our present culture of tolerance, isn't it? In fact, you've probably seen this bumper sticker on the back of some cars. Usually, well, I won't say that. Usually you get the idea. But here's someone who promotes syncretism in this bumper sticker. And as you look at this, these are symbols that represent different religions from around the world. You have the C that makes up Islam, and pacifism in the O. You've got gay rights movement in the E, and Judaism in the X, and you've got some paganism in the I, and Taoism in the S, and Christianity in the T. And at first glance, it looks like what this bumper sticker is saying is, listen, we just all need to get along with one another despite our differences. And I have no problem with that. I can get along with a Muslim if he lives next door to me. That's fine. And we can exchange garden products at the end of the summer with one another, and we can knock on each other's doors and help each other out. There's no problem with that at all. But I think what this bumper sticker is really intended to say is more than we just need to get along with one another. It suggests that all these different beliefs that are represented in this, all these different religions, these different philosophies are on an equal level. And it doesn't matter which one that you choose, that none of them is more better than the other. None of them is more correct than the others. It is politically incorrect to say anything different than that today. You just can't do that. You can't say that one religion is better, superior in any other way than any other religion. That's just not accepted in our society. And that was also the problem during the days of Elijah, that the Israelites didn't forsake Yahweh altogether. They just said, well, we're going to put Baal and Yahweh on the same level. And we're going to worship both of them, and we're going to receive the benefits of both of them. They just said, we're going to worship one in the morning, one in the evening. We're going to have the best of both worlds. But God has made it very clear, even from the very beginning of the nation of Israel in the Ten Commandments, that he wouldn't tolerate that kind of behavior. In Exodus chapter 20, verse 4, he says, you shall not make for yourself an idol, or any likeness of that which is in heaven above, or in the earth beneath, or in the water under the earth. You shall not worship them or serve them, for I, Yahweh, your God, am a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the fathers on the children, on the third and the fourth generations of those who hate me. And so he says there's some consequences to worshiping idols, and I don't want you doing that. In fact, it's not only going to affect you, it's going to affect your children and your children's children and their children as well. The choices, by the way, that we're making right now affect generations to come. And he says, I don't want any other gods that you're worshiping. I want to be your God alone. You know, tolerance is a wonderful quality in many areas. We're going to deal with difficult people in our lives. We have to tolerate them. There are people that are going to annoy you and aggravate you and do some things that aren't wrong but bother you. We've got to tolerate those types of people. But there are some areas of our life where we can't be tolerant. You know, some of you men here seem to be pretty tolerant people, and I appreciate that. You get along with other people well. You don't get your feathers all ruffled up very easily. But I can assure you of this, that when it comes to sharing your wife with other men, you're probably not that tolerant, are you? It's not all right with you at all for your wife to be intimately involved with 5 other men. You can't allow your wife to coexist with other guys. She's your wife, and you will not be tolerant of any man who wants to put himself on an equal standing with you as far as your wife is concerned. And that's the attitude of God, who says to us and to Israel in the days of Elijah, you are my bride, and I'm not going to be sharing you with anyone else. I'm not going to share you with Baal, and I'm not going to share you with Asherah, not anyone. Because he says, I am a jealous God. And that's not a bad thing. Us husbands, we need to be jealous for our wives, and our wives need to be jealous for our husbands. It doesn't mean that we're upset every time they talk to someone of the opposite sex. It just means that she is mine and I am hers, and we are alone for one another. And that is what God is saying. I want you for mine and mine alone. And so we have to make a choice. Jesus said something very similar in the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew chapter 6 and verse 24. No one can serve 2 masters, for either he will love the one and despise the other, or he will hold to one or be devoted to one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and mammon. It just doesn't work. Or you can fill that in with anything. You cannot serve God and fill in the blank. In this case, you cannot serve God and Baal. You know what the problem is with this? The problem is that we are trying to do many times exactly what Jesus said is impossible. He says you can't do it. And yet so many times in our lives, we think to ourselves, well, I can do it. I can serve Jesus and I can serve my job at the same time. That I can serve Jesus and I can serve my entertainment at the same time. I can put them on an equal level. It doesn't happen. One of them is going to give. And usually, unfortunately, it is Jesus that we give up. The Israelites thought they could worship 2 different gods at the same time, and they would just be fine. They thought they could offer sacrifices to Yahweh, then walk down the street and offer sacrifices to Baal. But brethren, do we do the exact same thing today? Do we worship here God, but then we walk down the street and we go to our houses and we worship the God of money, the God of entertainment, the God of myself? I want to tell you, we don't bow down to images of Baal today, do we? But we do bow down to other idols that we put in our mind that we sometimes put before God. An idol is anything that you place above God. And we don't like to think of it. We like to say to ourselves, no, Jesus is number one in my life. But just saying it doesn't make it so, does it? You want to know what the idol is in your life? What is it that you spend your time on the most? What is it that you spend money on the most? What is it that you spend your efforts on the most? When you look at your bank account, I think it'll tell you a good idea of who your God truly is. And so we need to consider who our God is. We love to say it's God, the one true God, Yahweh. But oftentimes we find ourselves trying to serve God and mammon. And Jesus says, you just can't do that. And what Elijah says to the Israelites is, make up your mind. You've got to decide who you're going to follow. If Yahweh is God, follow him. But if Baal, follow him. I want you to notice the response of the people at the end of verse 21. But the people did not answer him a word. They didn't say anything. Nobody raised their hand like Joshua and said, as for me and my house, we are going to serve the Lord. And nobody said, well, you know what, if I got to make a decision, well, I guess I'm going to go with Baal. No one said that. No one at all. And so Elijah says, you make a choice, and the people just stood there and they didn't say a word. Of all the things I believe that plague the modern church, this may be the biggest problem that we face. And that is spiritual indecision. The ability of people to make up their minds to decide whose side that they are really on. Because there are times when it seems like nobody wants to fully commit themselves to Christ. But nobody wants to completely turn their back on him either. So they just kind of sit there and do nothing without making any real commitment to the Lord. It's called lukewarmness. Nobody's vocal about it. And so we sit here and we do nothing. I appreciate our brother Jake saying about the election tomorrow. What are we going to do about that? I guess you in Ohio, what are you going to do about it? I can't do anything. That's called voter fraud if I show up. But what are you going to do? What are you going to do about that? You're going to sit back and do nothing about that? And again, I don't want to get political. I don't want anybody to think that at all. But we can't complain about things if we don't have our voice in them and we're trying to do something. I think many times we don't do something because we haven't fully invested ourselves in it. We haven't fully committed ourselves to doing what is right. So to help sway the decisions of the Israelites, Elijah threw down a challenge to the prophets of Baal. He sort of double dog dared them. You know, when you're a kid, you can dare somebody and they're like, wow, man, I don't know, I might do this. You double dog dare them and all of a sudden, okay, I'm doing it. Well, that's really what he does here. Because in verse 22, Elijah said to the people, I alone am left of the prophet of Yahweh, but the prophets of Baal are 450 men. Now, let them give us 2 oxen and let them choose the one ox for themselves and cut it up and place it on the wood, but put no fire under it. And I will prepare the other ox and lay it on the wood, and I will not put a fire under it. Then you call on the name of your God, and I will call on the name of Yahweh, and the God who answers by fire, he is God. Then all the people speak up and say, well, that's a good idea. This will solve everything. Now, really, this hardly seems fair, does it? If you think about all of this, because the other team here has 450 guys on their side, at least. And on this other side, there's only one of those. Now, you don't exactly go issuing that kind of challenge, do you, in sports? My boys and I, we like playing football. We threw a football around even this afternoon. We like going out and, you know, it's a wonderful thing. What if we're out in the yard and we're playing and I throw a pass to one of the boys and they catch it and it's just a beautiful pass and they run untouched to the end zone. They score. I'm thinking to myself, you know what? I've still got it after these years. I got that arm still. I think to myself, well, the real challenge is we're all big Colts fans in our family. And I'm going to go up to Indianapolis. And right across the street from my sister-in-law's house is this Colts training place. That's where they practice everything. I'm going to walk in there and I'm going to go to them and say, hey, I challenge you to a game. And they look at me and say, what, one-on-one? Are you kidding me? And I said, no. The whole 53 roster. And you can put them all on the field at the same time. And I'm going to beat you all. Okay. And these are professionals. And I'm just a preacher with an old arm. Okay. And yet I'm playing. They say, well, do you want us to go down to Owensburgh to play? You know, so you can have the home yard advantage. Can we play in your yard? No, I'm going to play right here at Lucas Oil Stadium. Right here. You have the home court advantage. Well, that's exactly what's going on here. But instead of a 53-man roster, it's a 450-man roster. And he is on their home court. And he says, you've got the home field advantage. And this is the game that you're supposed to be pretty good at. You're good at calling down fire, right? From your God. You're good at getting things from your God that you want. This is a game you're supposed to be good at. You know, the image of Baal is often pictured as one who held a lightning. Does this have a, yeah, it does, good. Yeah, I don't know if you can see this picture or not, but this is a relief that was dug up in Palestine. And this is the king of Canaan here, Phoenician king. This is supposed to represent Baal. And you'll notice in his right arm, he has a rod up here that is supposed to bring rain. We talked about this yesterday. God then withheld rain to show that Baal is not the one in control. But you'll notice in one of his left arms here, he has a lightning bolt, is what this is supposed to be. That Baal is the one who is supposed to be able to bring lightning. And notice out of the top of the lightning bolt is crops. And so they're supposed to be the one, Baal is supposed to be the one who brings lightning. He is supposed to be the one who brings down fire in his hand. If he couldn't make it rain, at least he could make a lightning bolt come down, right? So everything seems to be in the favor of these prophets of Baal. From a human perspective, this is a ridiculous challenge, but appearances can be deceiving. Very often we're tempted to measure success by how big something is, how loud something is, and they tended to do the same thing even 3,000 years ago. And Elijah continued to give the prophets of Baal every advantage possible. They were allowed to choose what bull they wanted. They were allowed to go first. And so there was no way that anyone could come back later and say, Elijah, you just didn't give us a fair chance. No. Elijah was determined to demonstrate beyond any shadow of a doubt that only Yahweh was truly alive and that he is the only God and you must serve him. So he gave his opponents every possible advantage in this contest. So it's the prophets of Baal. They go first in this contest. Verse 25 says this. So Elijah said to the prophets of Baal, choose one ox for yourself and prepare it first, for you are many, and call on the name of your God, but put no fire under it. Then they took the ox which was given to them, and they prepared it, and they called on the name of Baal from the morning until noon, saying, O Baal, answer us. But there was no voice, and no one answered. And they leaped about the altar which they had made. I love how the writer of Kings says that there was no voice. There was no one who answered. And the reason is because no one's there. There is no God that they are talking to. But from morning until noon, these prophets of Baal are chanting their mantras and they're dancing around the altar. They fall on their knees, bowing to the ground. They pleaded and they cried out to their God. Remember this God of thunderstorms and weather and rain and lightning, just to light this fire under this altar. One stroke of lightning was all they needed. Keep in mind, things have not been wet. There's not been rain or dew for the last 3.5 years. So this wood, any spark would catch on fire just like that. They just needed one little strain of lightning that would come down, but there's nothing. There's silence to all their cries. And meanwhile, and this is where it gets funny, Elijah begins mocking them. Remember how I said that on yesterday morning, Elijah is a man with a nature like ours? This is where we see this come in, because this is exactly what we would do, wouldn't it? He came about at noon that Elijah mocked them, and he said, call out with a loud voice, for he's a God. Either he's occupied, or maybe he's gone aside, or he's on a journey, or perhaps he's asleep and he needs to be awakened. And so he says, hey, maybe he can't hear you. So you need to be a little bit louder. Maybe that's the problem. Or maybe he's occupied. Maybe he's a little bit busy right now. Give him a little time. He'll come. Or maybe he's gone aside, which is a Hebrew idiom for he's in the restroom right now. So he's making fun of him. Maybe he's in the bathroom. Give him a little moment. Or he's on a journey. Maybe he's on vacation right now. He's gone away. Perhaps he's asleep. Gods don't need to sleep, do they? At least not the one true God. So he is mocking, and I'll tell you, Elijah was definitely not being politically correct, was he? You're not allowed to do this sort of thing in this country. You don't make fun of other people's religion, unless that religion happens to be Christianity. You can get in a lot of trouble for doing that. So if you're doing what Elijah did, you would be arrested today for a hate crime. And I'm not justifying, I'm not saying that we should go around mocking other religions at all. That's not what I'm saying. But I want you to understand, it wasn't just Elijah who was mocking them. Worse than that, it was their own gods that were mocking them at this time. Elijah really didn't need to say a word because those false gods of Baal and Asherah had given their worshipers false hopes, false aspirations, false expectations. They were making a mockery of themselves. But isn't that the way it always is? The gods of this world always do that. They make a mockery of themselves. It doesn't matter whether those gods consist of anything, something as absurd as a stupid chunk of wood that is carved into an idol, or some philosophy that views sex or materialism as their god. This world has always been plagued with false gods who promise to supply all the answers to life's problems, who promise to give you fulfillment and the joy that you're looking for. We'll give you what you really need, these gods around us say. We'll make you truly happy. People make academics their gods. They make sports their gods. And they say, if you want fulfillment, you want joy, this is where you're going to find it. You want joy, look to entertainment. That should be your God. And they promise all this. This is what is going to give life meaning, right? And in the end, they come up short just like Baal did. Nothing offers you true fulfillment like the true God of heaven. So as this hot sun-scorched day dragged on, the shouting of the prophets got even louder. And verse 28 says, so they cried out with a loud voice, and they cut themselves according to their custom with swords and lances until the blood gushed out of them. It was the ways of the pagans that they would cut themselves, that thinking maybe the gods would feel sorry for us and do something and act upon their pity for us. And then verse 29, when midday was past, they raved until the time of the offering of the evening sacrifice, which would be about 3:00 in the afternoon. So they've been doing this all day. But there was no voice, no one answered, and no one paid attention. Why? Again, because there's no one really there. In spite of all their cries, despite cutting themselves, there's no response. Well, now it's Elijah's turn. And there's a stark difference here because unlike the Baal prophets, Elijah acted very calmly. Verse 30 says, and Elijah said to all the people, come near to me. All right, I'm going to show you how this is done. So all the people came near to him, and he repaired the altar of Yahweh, which had been torn down. I mean, it hasn't been used in years. No one's interested in this. So he has to build this altar up. And Elijah took 12 stones according to the number of the tribes of the sons of Jacob, to whom the word of Yahweh had come, saying, Israel shall be your name. Now notice he gets 12 stones. One of them represents each of the tribes of Israel. And of course, he calls them the sons of Jacob, whom the Lord named Israel. Now, why does he point that out? Because the only person who can name someone else is someone who has ownership, right? I mean, I can't name your child when your child is born. Only I can name my child, and only you can name your child. And what God is saying here is they belong to me. And the proof is in the fact that I named them Israel. And so he takes this and he builds this altar that represents the 12 tribes of Israel. And so with these stones, he built the altar in the name of Yahweh, and he made a trench around the altar large enough to hold 2 measures of seed. And after the wood is gathered, the bull is butchered and placed on the altar, then obviously something surprising happens. In verse 33, he arranged the wood, he cut the ox in pieces, laid it on the wood, and he said, fill 4 pitchers with water and pour it on the burnt offering on the wood and the wood. So again, I mean, this is just going to make it harder to light, right? He pours four pitchers of water on this. And he said, well, do it a second time. They did it a second time. He said, do it a third time. And they did it a third time, and the water flowed around the altar, and he also filled the trench, and the water also filled the trench with water. So he collected this water, poured it over there 4 times, 3 pitchers. So 12 pitchers altogether of water. Again, 1 jar for each tribes of Israel, the nation. There's so much water that even the trench that they dug around the altar is filled up with water. When Elijah was finished here, no one would be able to doubt or question the power of God. And then Elijah prayed to God. In verse 36, at the time of the offering of the evening sacrifice, Elijah the prophet came near and said, O Yahweh, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and of Israel, not Jacob, but of the nation of Israel. Today, let it be known that you are God in Israel, and that I am your servant, and I have done all these things at your word. Answer me, O Yahweh, answer me, that this people may know that you, O Yahweh, are God, and that you have turned their heart back again. So again, let's look at this situation here. On one side, you have Elijah. On the other side, you have 450 prophets of Baal. And you have several hours of screaming and yelling and whooping and hollering and cutting themselves. And you have all these prayers to this fake God. And you have all this religious show. But then on the other hand, you have one man, a mountain man, God's man. And when he prays, he just prays briefly for 3 things. First of all, he prays, Lord, answer me so that they will know that you are the true God. He says that twice. He says, answer me so that they will all know that I'm your prophet and I'm doing your will. And thirdly, answer me so that the hearts of the people may be turned back to you. What a wonderful prayer that this is. This prayer is all about not himself. He's not concerned about himself, but about God's glory. What if we prayed that way? What if when we go out into the community, this is our prayer, that Lord, as I go out and live my life today, may I live it in such a way that people will know that you are God. And second of all, that people will know that I'm your servant and that they can trust in me as your messenger to the world. And answer me so that people's heart will be turned to you, God, that you use me in that way. What a wonderful thing to pray. Elijah's only concern was for God and for his work and for his glory and for his people. Lord, please answer me. No screaming, no whooping, no hollering, no cutting himself. You have to be impressed with the simple dignity of it all. And then suddenly a flash of fire fell from heaven on the altar. In verse 38, then the fire of Yahweh fell, and it consumed the burnt offering and the wood and the stones and the dust, and it licked up the water that was in the trench. So these huge piles of beef and wet wood now are just consumed in a moment. And each of the 12 boulders that were damp with this water around that made up this altar were obliterated. Remember what they represented? They represent the 12 tribes of Israel. And what God is saying is, look, I can strike you down and I can get rid of you just like this. That's in my control. And the temperature was so intense that the water is just immediately evaporated. It's all over in a few seconds. Where moments before an altar and a sacrifice stood, now all there was a burnt hole in the ground. Understand that the point of this story is not about Elijah. And the point of this story is not about the people. And the point of this story is not about Ahab. It's not about the prophets of Baal. But this story is about God, the one true God. And they got that lesson. Because in verse 39, when all the people saw it, they fell on their faces and they said, Yahweh, he is God. Yahweh, he is God. And so Elijah looks around, and all around him, there are probably thousands of people with their faces to the ground, flat on their faces, too frightened to look up, too frightened to raise their eyes lest they be consumed with fire, too afraid to face the God whom they rejected. And so they cry out in unison, Yahweh is God. Do you remember the meaning of the name of Elijah? My God is Yahweh. And so he has accomplished the purpose that he came to do, to try to show them that Yahweh is the true God. And so the showdown on Mount Carmel ended in a very dramatic victory for Yahweh. But there's only one more thing that needs to be done. And it wasn't a pleasant task, but it was a necessary one, because in verse 40, Elijah says to them, "Seize the prophets of Baal. Do not let one of them escape." So they seized them, and Elisha brought them down to the brook Kishon and slew them there. The brook Kishon was probably empty at this particular time, but it is a brook that flows to the Mediterranean Sea. It is a tributary of that. And so, no doubt, as the blood would eventually be washed away with the rains that would come in very shortly, it would get rid of that blood of these 450 prophets of Baal, not polluting the land that we see there. And of course, Ahab is there, and he has to approve of all this. He doesn't get in the way. He must recognize, yes, we lost the contest, and we lost 450 prophets of Baal. And so we look at this and we say, well, doesn't that seem a little bit harsh that he went and killed them? I mean, didn't they have a chance to repent? It sounds like a horrible thing to do, but I want you to think of it this way. Husbands, let me use you as an example again. Suppose the doctor tells you that your wife has cancer, and suppose she needs an operation to remove that cancer. And after the surgery is over, the doctor comes out of the waiting room and he says, "Your wife is going to be okay. The operation was a success." You have one question in the back of your mind, and the question is this: did you get it all? That's really the only important thing that matters. Did you remove the cancer? Because the prophets of Baal were this spiritually malignant tumor inside the people of God, and Elijah needed to remove it all. Otherwise, it would spread more. He wasn't going to leave any part of that tumor inside of the body of Israel. The end had come for the prophets of Baal. And so verse 41 says, "Now Elijah said to Ahab, 'Go up, eat and drink, for there is the sound of the roar of heavy shower.'" Now, there were no clouds overhead still. You still blue sky. The land around them is still very dry, but Elijah knew that rain was coming. Now the Israelites had turned back to God, and there's nothing to stop the rain. And in the next few verses, Elijah prays to God, and in verse 45, it tells us rain is on his way. In a little while, the sky grew black with clouds and wind, and there was a heavy shower, and Ahab rode to Jezreel. He goes back home. The drought is over. This spiritual drought was now over as well. And that's, I think, what it represents here. Brethren, we need to pray that a spiritual drought is ending in our country and in our communities and in our churches. Pray that the spiritual drought will end, and then get out your umbrellas, because there's a heavy shower coming. Let me make two applications, and then the lesson will be yours this evening. The first lesson I think we need to learn from all this is that numbers do not determine right and wrong. You know, at a first glance, it appeared that Elijah didn't have a chance, did he? Against 450 prophets of Baal. But numbers don't determine what is right and wrong. The important thing is to ask, it is not how many people agree with me, but rather, does God agree with me? Or better yet, do I agree with God? 450 to 1. How would you like those odds? Well, let me tell you something, brethren. I love those odds. Standing alone is one of the most invigorating things you can do if you're standing with the truth. Now, if you're not standing with the truth, it's not. Standing with a lie, obviously, you know you're going to fall every single time. But when you're standing with the truth, you know that you're going to be victorious in the end. That's the whole theme of the book of Revelation, by the way. Stay with God on his side and you'll be victorious. There are times in our lives where we may have to stand alone. And it seems like that. And you people, you young people, you ought to know that. In school, sometimes you're going to be the only one doing the right thing. When it seems like the whole world is going in the different direction, they have a whole nother agenda, and you're the only one standing up for God. It's important that you know that you're standing for the right thing. And there are many opportunities to stand for the truth in this day of age. And there's a lot of times you're going to be standing alone. You're going to be standing alone at work. Nobody else is going to have the same values that you do. They're going to be talking about things that you're not supposed to be talking about. And they're going to be doing things on the weekend, and they're going to be talking about the things that they've done. And you're not going to be able to have a part in that. There are going to be times when you're going to have to stand alone at home, unfortunately, for what is right. And sometimes you might even have to stand alone in the church. There are going to be people who say that they are Christians at work, at home, in the church, that don't live it, that don't actually stand up for what is right. There are a lot of fakes out there. There's a thousand wishy-washy Christians will never have the impact of a Christian who's on fire, who has the genuine power of God in their lives. If you're serving God with all your heart, your soul, your mind, your strength, I want you to be encouraged this evening that you are making a difference where you are. You may not see it, but you are. You're standing up for right. But if you're faking it, if you say that you're a Christian, maybe even look at it on the outside, but inside you're not living it and you know that, I want you to pay attention. God wants to light the fire under you again. And I hope and pray as we walk out of this place this evening, you are determined to do right, even when the rest of the world is doing what is wrong. Even those who are closest to you are against you. But let's also make this application that you have to make a choice who you're going to live for. It's just like Elijah said in verse 21, how long will you hesitate between two opinions? The New Century Version says, how long will you not decide between two choices? You see, the problem with Israel wasn't that they decided to get rid of God. The problem was they couldn't just decide which one they wanted to follow. If they had to choose one, it's difficult. As someone has once said, to not decide is decide not to. When Ronald Reagan was a child, he had an aunt. He tells the story that took him to a cobbler to get some new shoes made for him. And so the cobbler asked little Ronald Reagan, do you want square-toed shoes or do you want round-toed shoes? Ronald couldn't make up his mind. So the cobbler says, well, you think about it for a few days, come back to me and tell me and I'll make the shoes that you want. Well, a couple of days later, the cobbler saw Ronald Reagan walking around the town, and he stopped and says, hey, have you decided on what shoes you would like, round-toed shoes or square-toed shoes? And he said, well, I don't know. I just can't decide. The cobbler says, well, come to my shop in a couple of days and I'll have your shoes ready for you. Well, Ronald Reagan said that when he picked up his shoes, one was square-toed and one was round-toed. And he looked at the cobbler and the cobbler looked at him and he said, this will teach you a lesson. To never let people make your decisions for you from this time onward. And Ronald Reagan said, I learned right then and there that if you make your decisions, if you don't make your decisions, someone else is going to make them for you. And it is true. And I think that's an important lesson that we need to remember as we live this life. We've got decisions to make. Are you going to fully commit yourself to Christ or are you not? And some of you can't decide whether you're going to do that or not. There's a part of you that wants to follow God, but then there's a part of you that says, well, I'm not sure I'm ready to give up this other stuff, these things. If I become a Christian, then that means that I can't live this way anymore. And even as children of God, we're called to make a commitment each and every day to die and take up our cross each and every day. And we're still trying to decide, am I going to follow God fully today? Because if I do, I have to give up all of these things in my life. And that's hard because I don't want to give up this stuff because this stuff makes me happy, at least temporarily. And some of you are really struggling with this. But what Elijah would say to you tonight is, you've got to make a choice. How long will you limp between two opinions? Understand that God doesn't want to share the throne with anyone. There's a throne in your heart. And it's an empty one until we put someone on it. But understand that it is a throne seat. I've never been over to Europe, but I understand you can tour different castles and things like of that nature in England, Scotland. But I can guarantee you that when you go into the throne room and you're looking at the throne, there is never a throne pew. There's never a throne bench or a throne couch. It is a throne chair. It is a seat for one. And the same throne that is in our heart is a seat for one, and it has no more room for anyone but God or something else. And we have to decide who we're going to put on the throne of our heart. You either put God first in your life or you don't bother putting him anywhere at all. He doesn't want second place. God doesn't want your leftovers. So how long are you going to go on not making a decision? If Yahweh is God, follow him. As for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. And I hope you all make that same decision this evening. So many of you have, and what a blessing that is. But maybe this evening there's someone who has not chosen to follow God. Don't put it off any longer. Choose you this day whom you will serve. And you can give your life over to the Lord. Put him on the throne of your heart this evening. If you believe that Jesus Christ is the Son of God, if you're willing to change your life around, repent, confess your faith in Christ, to be immersed in water, to have your sins washed away, then you can place Jesus on that throne, but keep him there. And maybe there's some who've made that commitment in the past, but you failed in that commitment. We encourage you to come back to the Lord, make your life right with God this very evening. Make that decision, or someone else will make it for you. If you need to respond to the Lord's invitation anyway, why don't you come forward now as we stand as we sing.